Hi, good day. Thank you for joining me on this webinar. Today we'll be taking a look at requirements management. While we will touch on some theory, I will mostly focus on what works best in practice. I'm a very practical person and I prefer to use what works best at the time, irrespective of philosophy, methodology, or framework. And I don't really always use what the book has taught me. The one question most of you have touched on when expressing your need to develop as a business analyst was, how do I write a kick-ass specification? Or what should a good specification look like? My response to this is to take a step back to requirements management and focus on how to get quality information that we can use in that document. Even the best formatted document in the world is only as good as its contents. So let's have a look at requirements management and how we can make the most of requirements that we will end up with during our requirements management process. So our learning objectives for today would be the following. First of all, we would look at requirements management as a discipline and how we approach it. Then we look at the first phase, which is elicit. How do I get the information I actually need? Then we look at the second phase, the analysis phase, making sure that it actually supports our cause. And then we'll end with the documentation phase, the input that will trigger the next step of the process. So these are basically the things that we want to end up with at the end of the day is we need to understand all of these phases. We need to understand how to implement them and how to implement best practices that we'll talk about for each of these phases. So let's move on to requirements management itself. Requirements management can be quite a complex discipline, but I prefer to keep it simple because it is actually simple. There are essentially three phases in requirements management. The first one is the elicit phase. This is the task of gathering information that might contain requirements. I say might because, as I'll repeat later on, this is about collecting information and not validating. So you might collect a lot of information that does not really contain the actual requirement. But still you need to collect that information because you need to make sure that you don't miss something, you don't discard something that might be valuable at a later stage. The second phase is the analysis phase. This is where we need to understand the information that we have gathered using different techniques, and we need to classify it into different groups so we can understand how it relates to each other and how it supports each other. And then finally, we should be in a position where we can document this information. The document can be many different types of documents out there. It could be a specification, it could be a business case. That would depend on what your objectives are and where you as a business analyst fits into the organization and where you get involved in a project structure. So with that being said, let's jump into the first phase, requirements elicitation. The definition for elicit says to evoke or draw out a reaction, an answer, or a fact from a source. Two things that I want to stress here. The first one is it specifically says a draw out. This is very important. As a business analyst, you will need to use your communication skills to draw information out of people. People don't usually give up information willingly. It's not because of spite, but because they are not really sure what you're after. So it's your job as a business analyst to guide them and to draw out this information. The second point in this definition, obviously, is that you need to do this from a source. I specifically didn't use the term person or system or anything like that, because you would be getting information from many different sources. You might be speaking to actual stakeholders, looking at existing systems, doing research on existing documents, so forth. So any source that's at your disposal, you'll be using to elicit information from. So if we look at requirements elicitation, there are certain tasks that we need to execute to ensure that we keep this elicitation task process under control. It's actually more than just asking, reading, and listening when you do this. The first one, and probably the most important one, like anything you do or start out with, is to prepare for the elicitation. This is when you plan your approach. You plan what tools you will use, you plan what techniques you will use, and also when you would be doing these things. There's a very tight connection or an interlink between business analysis and project management. And this is one of the places where you need to understand things like scheduling and make sure that you actually schedule your tasks properly so that your stakeholders know when you're going to do this. You will use a lot of this information that you actually generate when you do your preparation to notify your stakeholders about what you're going to be doing it, why you're going to be doing, and when you're going to be doing it. And we'll talk about that a bit later, because that's actually a separate task that you need to take care of during your elicitation task that you'll execute. Then we are ready to actually move on to conducting the elicitations. Now, we will look at different techniques that we can use later on, but this is basically where we'll use these different techniques and go out and gather the information that we need to reach our objectives. Then once we started eliciting information, we get this information, we need to confirm the results. But be aware that this is not the analysis phase yet. This is merely a smoke test to ensure that the information that we gather actually makes sense. Remember that elicitation is an iterative process where we will return to clarify as many times as we need to get to a point where we are comfortable with the information we have. So be aware that confirming the elicitation results during the elicitation phase does not mean that we verify or validate information. We only make sure that it makes sense. It's not a lot of garbage that we're working with. Because remember the acronym garbage in GIGO, garbage in, garbage out. This is very much applicable at this stage. Then next, we need to communicate information. Very important. Your stakeholders need to be kept in the loop. They need to know and understand what you have gathered, what you think you have, and what they have told you, so that you can make sure that you are on the same page. This will actually make sure that information flows freely when you get to your next stage, which is manage stakeholder collaboration. When you communicate this information back, you need to make sure that it gets to the right stakeholders at the right time. The stakeholders might be groups of stakeholders, or it might be individual stakeholders. This is something that you'll determine when you do stakeholder analysis. But it's your job as an analyst to make sure that that collaboration works and the information is flowing freely where it needs to go to. So when we look at conducting, if we move back to the second task, if we look at conducting the elicitation, I mentioned that there are various techniques that we can use. So let's have a look at these techniques for a minute. The techniques could be any one of the ones that is listed in this matrix. You could use, depending on the complexity of your project, you could use 1, 2, 3. You could use all of them. Typically, from a practical point of view, I have found that typically you would use 1 or 2 from each of the different groupings. You'll see they sort of loosely grouped into sets of 3, and this is not on purpose, and there's no rule to this, but you'll see the first 3, the document analysis, interface analysis, and reverse engineering are all techniques that you can use by yourself. These groups these are just indicative of the group sizes. Typically, on a practical level, a small group of 1 to 3 and a medium group of 4 to 9 stakeholders, and then large of 10 plus. It might vary. These are just indicative numbers. So as I mentioned, this first 3 is normally something that you do by yourself. Document analysis is obviously where you read, do research on current processes, themes, and systems. The same with interface analysis, where you look at how components interface with each other, and then reverse engineering to see how something existing actually works. So these 3 requirements are typically something that you would start out with. In my personal opinion, again, this is not a fixed rule by any means, but my personal opinion is that document analysis should be mandatory for any project that you get involved in. What this means is basically that before you actually face any stakeholder, you need to have gone through all the documents at your disposal, and this includes things like project scope, project plans, business case, existing system documentation, anything that would guide you and help you to understand what the current situation is, the as-is state, and also what we are trying to achieve, the to-be state. No analyst should go into a project without doing document analysis first. And this is very important because this makes you look confident when you stand in front of stakeholders and you have to facilitate sessions. The next 3 grouping of 3 techniques, which would be observation, interview, and prototyping, is normally something you would do on a small group setting of 1 to 3 people. And again, it could be more. It doesn't make sense to have less, because you cannot observe. Remember, these exclude yourself, obviously, so you cannot observe nobody. So it would be at least one person. You cannot interview nobody. So typically you do that in a small group setting. And then the next The next three would be on a medium group setting, which would be brainstorming, focus groups, and requirements workshop. This is somewhere where you would have a group of stakeholders, and typically what you would do is you would group the stakeholders based on functionality or where they sit or function within an organization, and go through these brainstorming or focus groups or requirement workshops with these different stakeholder groups. Or you might actually intermingle stakeholders from different groups, just if depending on what your objectives are at that stage and what you're trying to achieve. And then the last one would be a survey. A survey is something that you would put out to a large audience. People can do this at their convenience. It's not a scheduled thing. There's only a endpoint, complete a survey by a certain date or a certain time. And this is the number of people that you can actually send a survey to is unlimited. This would give you a broad brush feedback on a specific subject that you would set up a questionnaire or something on. My practical experience is that typically I find myself using one or two techniques from the first group over here, and then based on the response I get from that, I might use one or two techniques in the second group. So after I've done my document analysis, I might decide to observe some people working in the operational environment, or I might decide to interview a few people to understand why something was done in a particular way previously. Or I might totally skip this and go directly into a workshop session, a JAT session, or a focus group. I rarely use surveys, but if you work with a very large stakeholder group, you might find this useful. And it's very important. This is where your planning comes in. You remember we talked about planning as our first task. During your planning, you would look at your stakeholders, you'd look at the complexity of the project and what you're trying to achieve, and then you need to decide which techniques would work best. Things like the complexity of your organizational structure, whether it's a virtual or a co-located group of people, group of stakeholders. All these things would have an impact on what techniques you would use and how you would use them. So it's very important to do that planning so that you know which techniques you will be using. It's important to understand that when you do your planning, it's not fixed. It's not fixed in concrete or anything like that. You can change your mind. Like I say, you might read something during your document analysis, or when you reverse engineer a system, and then you might say, okay, I didn't plan to have interviews, but now I need to do an interview. So your planning on what techniques you will be using is merely a guideline, but it's a very important guideline because you would have some direction on where you're going. So when you do your business elicitation, there are some best practices. Now, let me reiterate, like I said when I started out, I'm a practical person. So for me, it's about what works. It's not always about what the book says or what they've tested you during certification or anything like that. It's about how do I get the most and the best information in the most efficient way at this point in time, irrespective of whether I'm following a certain methodology or I'm working within a certain framework or I follow a specific philosophy. I use what works best, and you would adjust. I adjust as I go along, and I would suggest that you do the same. Don't be fixated on a specific way of working. Work in an efficient way and something that actually brings the best and the most value to the process. So some of the best practices for requirement solicitation would be make sure that stakeholder communication is foremost in your mind. Stakeholders must be part of the process every step of the way, and they must feel like they are part of the process. It's no use saying that they are a part of the process, but they don't feel that they are part of the process. The best way to do this is for them to know what's going on at all times. Communicate what you are doing, why you are doing it, and how you're going to do that. This way you will gain their trust and their support. It is very important. Even negative stakeholders. For negative stakeholders, you need to make sure that they understand this even more than positive stakeholders. Then, as a business analyst, you might get involved in a project at any of probably 10 to 100 different points in a project. But the entry point to any project would be either the project scope or the business case. And it's very important that you understand and know this by heart. You need to understand and know by heart what the business case says. Sometimes the business analyst is involved in drafting the business case. So you would know what the business case says. But if you are not part of that process, you need to understand what the business case states. What are the business objectives? What are we trying to do? What is the cause that we are actually promoting? And you need to understand also the project scope. While the business case will give you an idea of the broader scope, the project documentation will give you more detail on the actual scope. And again, the scope itself, that might be a different concept depending on whether you're working on a predictive or an adaptive, in other words, a waterfall or an agile type environment. But irrespective, you need to understand what the project scope says. You need to know your stakeholders. What are their level of interest? Is that interest positive or negative? This will allow you not only to speak to the right people at the right time, but it will also allow you to know how to handle them. A positive stakeholder is what you are after, and if all your stakeholders are positive, then you are in a good place. But unfortunately, in life, that's not always the case. But negative stakeholders can be your biggest friends if you handle them correctly. So stakeholder analysis is crucial. You need to look at your stakeholders. You need to analyze them. You need to see how they can help you, how they can hurt you, and how you can prevent them from hurting you / the project. And just on a side note, ignoring them, removing them, or suppressing them is not the way to prevent them from doing damage. in actual fact, it's quite the opposite. Then understand that elicitation is an iterative process. You need to iterate as much as is needed to get to a point where you have sufficient information and understanding of a requirement. Remember that this is the input to your next phase, which is your analysis phase. And as I mentioned previously, garbage in is garbage out. So continue and make sure that you have a requirement statement that is good enough that you can go back and analyze. In other words, this is not, again, like I say, this is not the verify or the validation phase. This is a smoke test to make sure that it actually makes sense. If somebody makes that statement to me, then I wouldn't look at them with a blank expression. I might take it wrong because I don't have the context. I might interpret it wrong, but still, it's not total garbage. Then, as I've just mentioned, validation is not the primary concern at this point. Validation and verification of the requirement will come. You'll be doing that during the analysis phase. During the elicitation, you as an analyst must be a sponge. You must take up as much information as you can, because you might use this information to formulate a design option during your analysis phase. So while it might not be a requirement in itself, that information might be relevant that will allow you to say, okay, this is a good option to achieve this objective. And then lastly, plan, and plan some more. One thing that I always tell junior business analysts is that you need to be confident, because there's nothing that is as obvious as fear or the lack of confidence when you stand in front of a group of stakeholders and they can smell that a mile away. And it's the same with planning. If you don't plan properly, it causes you to hesitate. And they can detect this hesitation, and that hesitation can be interpreted as a lack of knowledge. And you don't know what you're doing, and so I'm not interested, you're wasting my time. So planning is very important. Plan to the point where you feel that you are comfortable and you know what you're going to do and how you're going to do it. So let's move on to the next phase, which is the analysis phase. Now, analyze is described as examining something methodically and in a detailed way, typically in order to explain or interpret it. So this is what we're going to be doing in this phase, is we're going to be taking all this information that we've gathered during our elicitation phase, and we're going to examine it in detail so that we can get to a point where we can explain it properly and we can interpret it properly. Because as we'll see when we do verification and validation, one of the things that we need to do is we need to test it against a minimum set of criteria. And for us to do that, we need to be able to interpret it properly. So the tasks that we need to complete when we do requirements analysis are the following. The first thing is we need to specify and model requirements. this is where we put the requirements or the information rather that we have gathered into a workable format that is relevant and appropriate for the environment we're working in. So basically what we're doing is we're setting these requirement statements in a correct state. And by doing that, we should be able to see if this is actually something that makes sense or not. Think of this as taking a deck of cards and spreading them out on a table, and then turning them all the right side up so we can see what we have. Okay, and then we can see we have a complete suite of hearts, and we have a joker, and we have all the queens, and we have the kings, and things like that. This is typically what you do with in the specify and model requirements task. Then the next task that we need to do is we need to verify requirements. And this is where we make sure that it's a valid requirement by testing it against a minimum set of criteria. Okay, we'll talk about this because this is a very important task. So we'll talk about this one after we've completed the list of analysis tasks. And we'll go through all the different criteria that we might test it against. Then the next task is we need to validate the requirement. Now, verify and validate are two different things. Whereas verify only tells me whether this is a requirement that complies to certain criteria. The validate will actually tell me whether the requirement supports our cause. It supports the business goals and objectives. You might have requirements in your list of requirements that would verify correctly. It would pass all the checks based on my criteria list, but it does not support the business objectives or goals. And this would make it a redundant requirement for us. Something very important, in that case, it's not, and I'll mention this again, but it's never a good idea to throw away these types of requirements. Make sure you have some sort of a mechanism, a parking lot, something, a backlog where you can put it down as a very low priority. And I will reiterate this a bit later on again. And then the next step is we need to define the requirements architecture. This is where we make sure that the requirements actually support each other to achieve the objective. Requirements typically have some sort of a relationship to each other, and on some level, they will all support the same goal or objective. Some of the criteria that would be applicable when you define the requirements architecture is that the requirements should be maintainable. It should be traceable. You should understand why it is there. It should be usable, obviously, and it should be scalable. Those are good attributes to have when you look at your requirements architecture. Something like a conceptual model will give you this insight. And when we talk about the techniques, we're not going to talk about conceptual models as such, but we'll be talking about modeling and the different techniques that you will use when you actually execute these different tasks. Then the next one is to define the design scope. The design scope will provide you with a solutions approach for each of your requirements or a set of requirements. So in other words, if the requirement states that you need to be able to do something, then you need to say, okay, how will I be likely to achieve this? And you need to think about plausible, feasible ways of achieving that. And these would be your design options that you would list for that. Your design options will also obviously put you in a position where you might find areas of improvement that were not evident before. So in other words, if you have elicited a specific requirement from a stakeholder, they might not have stated an improvement on some area or some process or some function. But when you do your design scope, you might find that, okay, there's a lot more to this and there is room for improvement. And then the last task is obviously to analyze the potential value each of these design options will bring to the table, and then establishing which one or which ones would be the most appropriate ones to pursue. So it's also very important for me to mention at this point that you won't necessarily, as a business analyst, be involved in all these tasks. You might not have to actually, you might be part you might be part of a team that performs these tasks. You might have input into certain ones. Depending on your environment and how the organization is set up, you might only verify and validate the requirements and then pass these along for conversation with the development team if they use a Scrum framework or some other agile framework. And then it will become a conversation where things like the architecture and the design scope and the potential value and stuff will come up during the conversation, so that they will then scope it and say, okay, this is the best solution for this requirement. So it's not necessarily something that you as a business analyst will do on your own, but it is something that needs to happen irrespective of who the parties would be that will perform them. So let's move on to the one task that is definitely part of what you as an analyst will do, and it is very important, and this is the verify task. So verify means that the requirements meet a set of minimum criteria, and typically what this means is, if you have passed all the checks for these criteria, it means that you have got a good quality requirement, and it will not only ensure that the requirement makes perfect sense, but it will help to reduce uncertainty that could lead to bad quality and rework when something is actually delivered. The first one is, it must be unambiguous. So there must be one and only one understanding of a requirement with no room for interpretation. If the no room for interpretation is something that's very difficult for you to comprehend, then go for the smallest room of interpretation. If you're working in an agile environment or in an environment where you use some sort of a lean method, this will lead to a conversation where this can be clarified. But if it's unambiguous completely, that would be your number one goal and first prize. Then the second criteria would be that it needs to be complete. It should complete everything that you need from the start to the finish while still being concise. It shouldn't be a long-winded thing. It should be concise, to the point, but it should tell me exactly what I'm trying to achieve, what I want to achieve. If you look at something like a user story, the criteria for a user story basically says who the stakeholder should be, what he wants to do, and what objective is he trying to reach with that. And that gives you from the start to the end what I want to achieve. Then it must be verifiable. In other words, it must be possible to verify the correctness of the requirement. So it must be testable. You must be able to set a set of acceptance criteria for that requirement so that you can say, yes, I tick the boxes, it does this, this, and this, and it's fine. And then it must be consistent. I've come across many requirements that actually contradict themselves within a single statement, or it contradicts other requirements or other functions or other processes. So no contradiction must exist within itself or other functions or processes. It must be consistent. It should be usable or feasible within the context of the system, and it should add value to the process. It's obvious that if you have a requirement that's not usable, it's null and void. But don't take it for granted that it is usable. Make sure you test it. Then it should be prioritized, or you should be able to prioritize it. You should be able to rank it or to group it in terms of importance and value. There's no such thing as everything has got the same importance. Something is more important than others, and that's why you use both importance and value. This will give you a ranking as far as priority is concerned that should be unique in itself. Then it should be motivated. There should be a valid business motivation. Why I want this? Why do I need this? Because I think it will be nice is not a valid business motivation. There's a lot of requirements that you'll find that users will raise that they're not must have. They want. I want this, and I want this, and I want this. It's important that you establish the business motivation. Then a requirement should be self-contained. You should be able to take a requirement and express it in a way that makes sense by itself. This does not mean that it doesn't rely on something else, but everything you need to deliver on this requirement must be self-contained in the statement. And then lastly, but very important, it must be understandable. It must represent terminology that is used and is understood by the intended audience. So this is again where you need to make sure you understand your stakeholders, because if you understand your stakeholders, you'll know what language do they speak, what terminology do they use, and how should this requirement be documented. So some of the techniques that we would use during the analysis phase are the following, and there's a huge list. This is by no means all of them, but these are the most common ones that you'll come across. The first one is acceptance criteria. You need to be able to set up a list of acceptance criteria. This is against which you will evaluate the requirement, and this will tell you whether this is a doable or a good requirement or not. If you cannot do a set of acceptance criteria for a requirement, then it's not a requirement at all. The next technique is probably the most common one, is modeling. There's a huge list of modeling techniques that you can use. things like business modeling, conceptual modeling, data modeling or data flow modeling, decision models, process models. This would depend on your requirement and what you're trying to determine. Like I mentioned previously when we talked about the tasks, if you're looking at design options and things like that, you would probably be using conceptual models to model something and see conceptually how it would work, what would be feasible and not, what would work best and stuff like that. If you want to show how or determine how data would flow between components or systems, you would do data or a data flow model, and so forth. So there are different modeling techniques that you would use, many of them, and you would choose one that's appropriate to what you want to achieve and to your environment. Then we have decomposition, typically functional decompositioning. This is where you identify parts of a more complex business process or a business function. So you would decompose a larger statement into smaller ones and see how they all fit and work together as a unit. And then we have interface analysis, which you would use quite a lot if you're working on a larger complex project, where you will identify and validate that you have the correct inputs and outputs between different components, different modules, different systems. Then you'd have prototyping, also a very common technique that you would use to visualize the planned solution. So typically, if you want to see if something is feasible and would actually work in real life, you would do a prototype using different tools that's at your disposal, like wireframing. There are many software tools that you can use to do prototyping, but this just helps you to visualize the planned solution in the end of the day. And then we have business use cases. Sorry, a use case illustrates the user interaction, user being actual users or systems. But the use case tells you in different scenarios how they would interact with each other and what the results would be. And then the last one and probably the one that's at the forefront most these days with all the agile frameworks out there is user stories. And this is just a plain simple English statement of what a user wants to do in order to achieve a specific goal. These are the different techniques that you would use during your analysis phase for your requirements. Some of the best practices that we should use during the analysis phase would be to always think big. What I mean by that is be aware of relationships and dependencies between all these requirements and statements that you have gathered and documented. So big picture thinking is crucial. Don't think small, don't think about just the requirement. Think about how it could impact other requirements in the end of the day. Again, if you do your different, if you use your different techniques and you do modeling, this will, and things like decision modeling will actually show to you how different decisions will impact things downstream and how different components will impact components around them. Then we need to categorize requirements. You need to make a distinction between functional, non-functional, and transitional requirements, not because they are the one is more important than the other, but just because it will help you to manage and keep track of these requirements properly, and also to understand the relationship and especially if you look at transitional requirements, you'll understand when you can get rid of those and when they have served their purpose. Then the third one, very important. I've mentioned this previously, but never discard anything. You could use information that seems irrelevant to you at a later stage. You might not use it. It doesn't matter. The fact is, never discard something because you think it's not useful. Depending on your environment and the tools that you use in that environment, you can put it in a different spreadsheet, in a parking lot. You can put it at the bottom of a backlog. You can have a different backlog if you wanted to. That would be up to you. But the point is, never discard anything that you feel is irrelevant to the scope of the project. The only thing you're going to do, you're just not going to pursue it further at this stage, but you might go back at a later stage and dig it out when you need it. They never close the door. It's an iterative process, as I've mentioned, so you will go back as many times as you need to go back and confirm and reconfirm when you're in doubt. The conversation never stops. This is something that Agile and Lean methodologies have taught us as well. The conversation should never stop. So never close the door and say, okay, this is done. Sorry, if I don't understand this or I don't have this, I'll just make an assumption. You go back and you reconfirm. And then you need to confirm up to the lowest level of acceptable detail. Ensure that there's enough detail available to proceed to the next step. So if the next step you're going to document, or the next step is you're going to have a conversation, or whatever the case might be, you need to make sure that you have enough detail so that you can go into that next step with confidence. If not, go back, get what you need, confirm what you need, and then move forward. But you need to keep on until you get to the lowest acceptable level of detail. And there are many other things that best practices that you could use during your analysis phase. These are some of the most relevant and important ones I've found to be useful. So our next phase is the documentation phase, and the definition of a document is to record something in written, photographic, or other form. Mostly in our case, it would be written, and it would be written in many different formats, different document types for different audiences. If we look at some of the document types that we would have for requirements, or can be classified or grouped under requirements, this is vast. Not only because there could be a lot of documents, but also because of terminology and approaches by different industries or business domains or organizations. You could have the same document going under 20 different names and acronyms. I've stopped keeping track of acronyms. Even I've been doing this for more than 2 decades, and I even have to go to Google and Google acronyms sometimes because they just keep on coming up and people just make up new acronyms every single day. So don't be discouraged or confused by that. Your approach and your environment will dictate the appropriate document type that you'll be using. But in general, you'd be looking at something like a business requirements document, a BRD. It could go under different names. Some people might even classify it as a business case. Typically what I find is your business requirements will be part of a section in the business case, but in some instances it's a different document. Typically, this would be the business objectives at a high level of abstraction. It doesn't define the detail of requirements and of functions. It's a high level of abstraction. This is one where I've actually seen places and people using business requirements document, or as I call it, a BRD, as an actual functional requirement document. I'm not saying it's right or wrong. I'm just saying that different people use different acronyms and naming, but in general, a business requirements document isn't to a low level of abstraction. One which is, though, is the functional requirement document. Again, the functional requirement document goes by many names, like a functional requirement specification, a user requirement specification, a system requirement specification, and so forth and so forth. It would depend again on the audience and the environment. Please don't break your head about this. Understand what is required in your specific environment. Understand what do you need to communicate in this document, and then use terminology that is acceptable and understood by everybody. It's no use going into an environment where they expect a business requirements document to list functional requirements in detail, but then insisting on calling it a functional requirement document. My philosophy is, if it makes sense to the audience that will be using it, go with the flow. It's no use fighting it, because most of these things are well ingrained and established in large organizations. Then the third type of document that you will find as well is an interface control document. Again, goes by many different names and acronyms, but basically it defines the integration requirements or the integration level between different components or systems. And typically an interface control document is a bit more technical than something like a functional requirements document. It contains business logic, but also it contains technical logic. So it might say, on a business level, it might say, if I receive this piece of data in my system, what should happen in the system? Then on a business level, something will happen, something will transform, or the state will change. But it will also say how that piece of information will get from point A to point B and so forth, which is more on a technical level. So if you're working on a complex integration project, you would definitely have some of your user requirements that you've elicited in a interface control document. And then lastly, and very importantly, you would have some sort of a traceability matrix. Your traceability matrix is just basically a way for you to track a requirement from initiation, the source, all the way to completion or the implementation. And you should be able to know at any given moment in time what the current state is and where it is. And if you need to go back, remember, iterative process. If you need to go back, you will know where to go to, because your requirement or your traceability matrix will tell you where this requirement originated from. Again, This could be done in many different ways and formats. You could be using software tools like Jira, Confluence. You could use just a normal spreadsheet. You can use online tools, but the essence is that you need to have requirements traceability, and this traceability is referred to as a traceability matrix. How you record it is up to you and the tools that is at your disposal. So some best practices for requirement documentation. These requirements, like I said in the beginning, I'm not going to go into how do you write a good conceptual model or how do you write a good use case. Those are topics in their own right. But these best practices, these are practices that you can implement irrespective of the type of document that you write. So if you keep these practices in mind, then the result of your document should be of good quality. The first thing is never assume. Don't put something in a document that's an assumption, except if you have an assumption section like you would have in a project plan, which says there are these assumptions exist, and these assumptions must be true in order for us to deliver a specific deliverable. But don't assume anything. Rather go back and clarify it. The second one is be clear and concise. There was a time in the 90s and the early 2000s and probably a bit closer, where the value of something was judged by the thickness of the document. So if I put a document in front of you and it had 5 pages, it went at the bottom of the pile because other documents had 50 or 150 pages and they were deemed to be more important. Those days are over. Be clear and concise. Remove anything that's redundant, is not of value. Get to the point and say what you need to say. The first draft is always crap. Live with it and get over it. If you're going to try and write a first draft that is perfect, you're never going to publish anything. You're going to miss a deadline. If you have to submit a document for review by Wednesday and you keep on trying to perfect this thing, you're going to miss Wednesday. That's a given. So do your best with the information at your disposal. It doesn't mean that if the first draft is crap that you should do a crap job. It just means that there's a 99.9% chance that it will come back for changes, for improvement, and things like that. So live with that. You will do a second, a third, or a fourth draft, even a 10th one, if it comes to that. Then remove redundant information, and this goes back to being clear and concise. Don't try and pad statements just to make something look bigger, fancier, more important. If it doesn't belong there, remove it. If you have, let's take an example of an interface control document. What people would do sometimes, if it's a very complex integration, they might split the technical part of an interface control document and the business part of an interface control document into 2 separate documents. And you would find that people tend to repeat what is in the one document in the other one. It's better to reference a document than to repeat information. There are cases where you want to repeat something, but try and keep it at a minimum and try and use it only when it makes sense. Don't use it just because you're doing a cut and paste job and it gives more weight to the document as far as physical weight is concerned. Then pay attention to negatives. We always focus, and this is natural human tendency, we focus on the positive when it comes to achieving something. How do I achieve something? And we would normally say, to achieve something, we need to do this, 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 and this. And we list 5 items of what we should be doing to get to the end goal. What we almost always fail to do is we fail to list what we shouldn't do, or what we should do if something goes wrong. In other words, the negatives. If we don't do or list or pay attention to the negatives, what happens is somebody will make an assumption, and that assumption might be wrong, and it will result in a rework or some unhappiness on somebody's part. So pay attention to negatives and make sure you state what needs to happen in a negative condition. And then we need to adopt appropriate terminology. We mentioned this previously. Adopt terminology used by the larger audience of your stakeholder groups. Don't try and reinvent the wheel and use fancy acronyms that you might think, even if they are industry standard, if they're not being used in the domain that you are functioning in, then avoid them. Use the appropriate terminology that will be understandable and accepted by the stakeholders. And then never use catch-all phrases. Catch-all phrases are things like etc., not limited to, those types of things. Don't use catch-all phrases, even if it means that you have to elaborate for 2 more paragraphs, then do it. Explain what etc. means. If something is not limited to, what is it limited to then? But don't avoid catch-all phrases. And then lastly, but very importantly, write your document for me, not for you. What I mean by this is, if you write a specification or any document, you must write it in a way that your audience will understand. We all have a way of thinking and interpreting, and it's all different. But when it comes to writing a document, you need to stand in the other person's shoes. You need to understand how they think and what they want to hear. And that is how you will write it. You can write the best document in the world that makes perfect sense to you, and when I read it in isolation, it doesn't work. If you write a document and you give it to me, and I have to go back to you only once to ask you, what do you mean by this? You have failed in that objective, because you have not written the document for me. Granted, there are certain people that are slow to understand, and we will always have that, but as a rule, your stakeholders shouldn't be coming back to you and saying, listen, what do you mean by this? Can you clarify this? Then it means that you've written the document for you and not for them. So in conclusion, just a few points. Use what works. Be practical. My philosophy is I'm not an agilist. I'm not any sort of business analyst that conforms to a specific methodology or framework. I use what works best in my specific environment and at that time. If it's an hybrid of something, then so be it. It's always good to understand what you're working with, but don't let it put you into a box and limit what you can do. Plan, but never overanalyze. Don't plan up to the point where you have a good plan that you're confident with. Don't keep on planning until you've overplanned. There is such a thing as overplanning or overanalyzing. You need to understand when to stop and say, this is good, I can move forward with this. Then adapt. Don't reinvent the wheel. This goes very closely with use what works. If you have something that you can use, adapt it and use it. Don't think that I cannot use that because that doesn't fit in with this methodology, it doesn't fit in with this framework, or things like that. Don't keep on reinventing the wheel. Use what works, adapt what you already have, and move forward.